The topic tonight, feminism and work, could not be more topical. If we think back on some of the events of the last 2 years, many of you may have participated in some of the women's marches right after President Trump's inauguration. Many of you may have participated in some of those marches, not only around the country, but also around the world, and I think that also spoke to the diversity of the agenda for women. The Me Too movement over the last year, I think, has also highlighted the continuing problems of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace across a broad spectrum of professions and job sectors. And I think also more recently the experience for many here in Washington, but also around the world, of watching the Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings was also a reminder that there are many issues, many things that may not have changed over the last several decades. But on a more positive note, we've seen in the United States in these last midterm elections record numbers of women running for office at all levels, many of them for the first time, many of them successfully. And I just noted actually today before leaving Berlin that Frau Merkel, the German chancellor, was calling for parity in German politics. So we have a lot of...
Not just her.
Just her, not just her.
Not just her.
Not just her. So there has been a lot of debate about these issues, highly charged, highly public debate, and so I expect that we will have a lively discussion this evening. And I do want to note that this is intended to be interactive. A few words about the format. After I introduce our two panelists, we'll have some discussion amongst ourselves here, but then I would like to open this up to your questions and your comments, because I think we have the opportunity to draw on different generational experiences as well as different professional experiences. But first, let me introduce our two most highly qualified speakers for this panel. And let me begin. I actually am not going to go into long introductions.
Thank you.
Because I want to have more time for discussion. Jutta Allmendinger, to my immediate left, president of the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, the Berlin Social Science Center, and professor of educational sociology and labor market research at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. As was noted, she's currently one of the first fellows at the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles. Professor Allmendinger's research focuses on gender inequality in the workplace, the sociology of the labor market, educational reform in Germany, and she is widely published. To her left is Kate Godall, who is co-founder and chief executive officer of Halcyon. It's a nonprofit organization based here in Washington, D.C., and committed to providing space and access to emerging leaders in social entrepreneurship and the arts, interestingly enough, to solve 21st century problems. Among Kate's many accomplishments, she helped to establish WE Capital, a consortium of businesswomen who invest in and support women-led companies. Among Halcyon's areas of focus is diversity in all of its dimensions. So I think we have two highly qualified panelists to talk about the topic of feminism at work. What I would like to begin with is really a very general, it is sort of a sweeping question, but I think one that reflects a lot of the debate that we've seen over the last few years. What is feminism today? Jutta Allmendinger, if you think about that question, what is feminism today? And perhaps to make it a little bit more concrete, what do you think the two or three most important things, what are the two or three most important things that feminism needs to accomplish?
Well, thank you for this question, and also thank you for inviting me, having me here. It's a pleasure of mine, really it is. Well, I actually usually have a hard time to define feminism because I first depart from constitutional rights. All men and women are equal, but this does not only mean that I have problems in saying that men and women are equal, but also that we have huge differences between refugees and non-refugees, migrants and non-migrants, that we have huge difference between the elderly and the younger people, or people with good or bad education. So I usually address all differences, and one of those differences is gender. And then, of course, we have to talk about this intersectionality, that older women who are female and age and migrant status sort of add up. So this is the first thing which concerns me a lot when I talk about feminism, that I do not want to exclude other big discrepancies in the society. The second is that, when we talk about legal issues, and we went a far way to this, I mean, in Germany we have this one paragraph that men and women are equal since 1949, actually way after we yesterday celebrated the 100 years that women had the same right to vote, and so this came 30 years later. We also have this addendum that the state has to make sure that those legal rights are also translated into actual rights, so that we do not have legal rights is one thing, so the constitutional rights is one thing, but the other thing is how do you manage that men and women, for this matter, have the same access first, and second, that they have the same results. And this is one of the most problems in Germany, because we can say that they have more or less the same access to given labor market, educational system and things like this, but in terms of outcomes, there are huge difference. There are huge difference in terms of the political standings, so where, how high is a percentage of women in the German parliament. Every second person can vote and is female, but only every third people, not even every third people is represented in the parliament. If we look at the local level, it's even less. Only 10% of women are, only 10% of all mayors are women. So this is even worse. And if you look at the representation of women in ministries, then it's even worse again. I mean, it doesn't get worse than that. But if we look at the labor market, we also have the very same pictures. Gender wage gap is still huge. We hardly have any women in leadership positions in the free market, but also we don't have a lot of women in academia. So if you look at the major, it's a DFG, it's male, hello DFG, it's all male, but also the Leibniz or the Helmholtz or the Max Planck Institute, they're all governed by male people, and if you look at the highest ranks of professorships, they are to 80% male as well. So whenever I look at outcomes, you know, we have this huge gender disparity. So the third point I probably want to make is that we cannot assume that men and women have, as a group, the same interests. So there are women who quite think differently compared to other women about certain issues like abortion or like the right to marriage for all people and things like this. And we have to accept this as well. But the differences between the group or within the group of men and within the group of women, of course, makes it very hard to come up with a women's movement, in particular in Germany, because you have this partisan membership always first in the moment, and the group membership as women second. The question I'm dealing with right now is how can we manage to have a drive for female issues across all political parties, because this is what we need to have to change the way Germany is governed and the way the private sector responds, and also the way how we can address those profound gender differences in academia as well. So we have to acknowledge differences among women and among men as well. So I think that I'll stop with those four issues which I just mentioned.
Thank you, Jutta Allmendinger. And I hope we can come back to some of these, because I think this question of the diversity of perspectives and of needs, given the diversity of women and of within society more generally, has been a challenge in the United States as well. And I think it would be interesting to talk about what is being done in Germany and the US.
Yeah, also Americans almost tell me, you know, how wonderful Germany is. I would say that Americans did much, much better in this respect than Germans did and do, looking at the last midterms, because they were really in a couple of areas joined forces and organizations which really brought together women first, irrespective to which party they belong, and we don't have this in Germany.
We'll come back to that. Kate Godall, let me turn to you and ask you the same question. You come from a different sphere of activity, largely focused in private sector entrepreneurship. What is feminism to you?
To not have to answer that question anymore, right? to sort of kill it off as an issue entirely. Yeah, I think, I'm also honoured to be on this panel, particularly with you. I have a feeling I'm going to be learning things tonight because I do come at this much more from a practitioner standpoint. Halcyon supports creative change makers who are striving for a better world. And we started with an incubator for social entrepreneurs. So many of them are by virtue tackling problems that have intersectional issues at their core, certainly environmental issues and lack of democratic access to healthcare, education, you name it. Over time, we have nurtured over 60 companies and now artists as well, by providing them with a variety of resources. They have created a number of jobs, they've raised a lot of money, they've impacted lives around the world. But most importantly to me, 52% of our companies are founded or co-founded by a woman and 59% by a person of color. This was not achieved by quotas, but we did have to really work at making sure that the applications that we were getting met the percentages of people that we wanted in the outcome, right? And that meant that we had to put concerted effort, largely in making sure that everyone felt like it was for them, like inviting everyone to apply, because we all know if women can check 8 of the boxes, they'll apply for the job, and if men can check 4 of them, they think it's equally for them. So just a little bit more effort in getting beyond those issues. So to that end, we then have this very diverse and very unlike many, specifically tech incubators, diverse core of people that we're incubating. But investors do not reflect our entrepreneurs, even slightly. So if you look at any venture capital statistics, and like many things these days, unfortunately, they're backsliding. So 2016, they were actually higher than 2017. 2016, 6% of venture capital went to women-founded companies, and 1% to companies with a founder of color, and a de minimis amount to companies that were founded by Black women. And so, if our entrepreneurs with those ratios are going to those investors, you can imagine the outcome. And women and people of color get a very much higher percentage. I think it's 70% higher number of questions about the risks of their companies than more traditional entrepreneurs will get. So, even in the outcome, you're being set up to fail. So we do a few things at Halcyon to work around that, and there are things that I think we could all, to your question of like, what do we need to do? These are things that we can all learn and strive for together. One thing that we do is work with traditional investors so that they can see the opportunities that they're missing, because they work on pattern recognition, and I understand that. But if you point people to the opportunity to make money that they may have missed because of their own bias, sometimes you can get them to take a second look. Secondly, we work to create new investors, so women and investors of color who, may naturally be more inclined to work with these companies. So We Capital came out of that, for example. And then lastly, we try as our best to prepare entrepreneurs for the world that they face. So how do you take a question about the risk of your business and pivot away from it, maybe towards a slightly more optimistic answer that would be the answer that a white male would have the opportunity to give. And this impacts artists too. It's no surprise, but always useful when someone doesn't believe the systemic nature of this problem, to point out that you've got almost parallel stats in the arts world. So museums in the Western Hemisphere, about 5% of their collections are by women artists. This is a great statistic by the Guerrilla Girls and others. And similar, 1% of museum collections by artists from the African diaspora. So these are the statistics that across the board, across sectors, prove out who historically has been placed, has been considered valuable, right? And in what proportions. So that's sort of a good quantifiable way of looking at the problem that we're all facing, and just some of the things that we're doing. Some other things that I think we could collectively prioritize, although there's so many, and you mentioned, certainly political movements and pushes. Obviously, maternity leave and childcare just would be huge equalizers, especially in America. It's less so in Europe. But America's still just pathetically behind with anything like that.
Since you both focused on outcomes, and Kate, you touched on a couple of the things that you're trying to do to affect different outcomes. And I saw some disagreement on the last point, some very concrete ideas that have been put forth. I'd like to turn back to Jutta Allmendinger and say, okay, if we're thinking about outcomes, and I'd actually like to drill a bit deeper on one of the examples that you mentioned, which is the broader academia, the scientific community, scientific institutions, where we haven't necessarily seen a lot of change in terms of women's full participation, particularly in leadership positions. So how do we affect different outcomes, perhaps with some examples from that specific sphere?
Thanks a lot. This is a good question, because I indeed missed, from the one hand, the constitutional rights and the outcomes. And of course, there is an intervening variable. And the intervening variable, as I call it, and she already mentioned it as well, our culture, our stereotypes which we bring towards men and women, and they are quite different. And I give you an example of one of the recent studies we did at my institute back in Berlin. We looked at ads where people were looking for good employees. And we wrote a lot of applications. And those applications always worked with the same vita. There are two differences in the vita. The one is it's a female person applied, and the other one is a man person who applied. This was a first difference. All other things being equal. The second difference was that the man was 2 months on maternity leave, the women as well. And the other man was 10 months on maternity leave, and the woman as well. And then they were sitting in our institute waiting for letters to know who is getting invited, who is not getting invited. And what we found out is that women who only took 2 months were not invited as often as women who took out 10 months of maternity leave. So this is sort of counter. You said maternity leave, wonderful. Whenever I meet Americans, they say, oh, you have this maternity leave, that's great, But you also have to consider that it's a sort of a lock-in effect. So when we went back to these employers and we said, well, why didn't you invite those women who only took off 2 months? Because those would be stable factors in your labor force. They could have been sick for 2 months or whatever. 2 months is nothing. They told us, well, they don't seem to be nice and friendly and caring. So because in Germany you think that women who are then mothers need to take care of their babies, need to interrupt, need to nurture, and if you don't do this, you are considered as a witch. If I exaggerate a little bit. So in Germany we have this no-win situation. Either women stay out for only 2 months and then they are not considered nice and friendly, and then they don't even get the option to apply, or they take off 10 months and then they have a hard time getting back in the labor market. And we see this all the time. So this re-entry process is really hard. Interestingly enough, For men, it didn't make any difference whether they stayed for 2 months or for 10 months out of the labor. It didn't matter. So they had exactly the same proportion of invitations for a job application. And those are the things, that we are still filled with stereotyping. What is considered to be right for women, what is considered to be right for men, and that those things change or are different between men and women and do not change quickly enough. And I could tell you many, many other things where female behavior is attributed quite differently from the very same male behavior. And we have to overcome it. This is one of the parts I really take on as a scientist who just doesn't want to do pure science and experiments and statistical analysis, but also bringing those results back to the society. And then it makes click. It changes the ways they think, and they're getting reflective, in particular when we go to organizations and confront them with the results we got from their own research. So this is probably very lengthy, but I think a very hands-on example of one of those things we are doing.
I think it's interesting that you've also both mentioned the cultural dimension. And I'd like to actually dig a bit deeper on that, because I think one of the interesting things, at least we've seen in the US in the last few years, I don't know to the same degree in Germany, is a sense or perception by some or fear that the progress that women make in empowerment, also in the workplace, has a sort of zero-sum quality. There are some that feel threatened by what is fundamentally important societal change as it relates to the role of women in the workplace, but more broadly. And I'd like to probe a bit about perceptions of feminism in Germany and in the US. But Kate, perhaps first to you, how do you think feminism is perceived in this country? What changes do you know, if any?
Yeah, gosh. So as you were talking, I was thinking about some stuff that I've read recently around specifically in Germany and the perceptions of motherhood, right? And how women in Germany just choose not to have children as the baseline to getting around that. But similarly, you've got these I think differences between US and Europe, and tell me if I'm wrong, around how we think about affirmative action, or I think Europeans sometimes call it positive discrimination, right? Or quotas, and how those should be applied, if at all. And then in Europe, where they've really started to make good use, I think, of public shaming of companies that don't have at least 40% of their board comprised of women, or certainly in France, I think they're doing things like that. Whereas that has not been something that's taken hold in the US yet. I think that we have definitely seen examples in pop culture of gender fatigue. Right? Every time there seems to be momentum and a gain, I feel like there's a similar backlash, and we sort of take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, hopefully only 1 step back. I think you saw the Women's March in reaction to Donald Trump's election, right? And then the Me Too movement, perhaps direct line from the Women's March, and then you get Kavanaugh, and we just sort of seem to keep going back and forth, and it's all intensified by the internet and social media, right? Which we'll get to, so I'll stop there on that point. I do want to point out, I'm wearing a t-shirt by a women-led company called The Outrage, and they're amazing. They support all kinds of activist movements, but largely one of their customers is the women's movement, so you can buy t-shirts from them and the proceeds go to support people like that. So there you go, The Outrage. There you go.
Very good. I do want to come back to the technology point, but I want to turn back to Jutta Allmendinger and ask, are you seeing this in Germany as well, sort of a backlash or reaction to, because it is hard to avoid the sense in the US that we're having this sense of you step forward, but then there's sort of backlash, and I think particularly the Kavanaugh hearings really brought
like you
to
were
the
saying
surface.
before we started, there's, it's definitely sort of a feeling that as women move forward, they're taking something from someone else and therefore need to be sort of tamped down again.
Well, there are a couple of answers to this. First of all, quota have been mentioned. Quota systems are extremely successful in German politics. So when you look at the Green Party or the Social Democratic Party, the Green Party in particular, they have 50% of women because they have a quota system since the very beginning. And whenever you vote for the Greens, you can be sure that a huge number of women also enter parliament because it's just 50-50. If you vote for the Free Democratic Party, or in particular for the Populist Party, if you want to put it like this, the Alternative for Germany, then you know for sure that more or less no woman will enter parliament. So those two parties, they either have a quota system or they don't have a quota system, and it's highly effective. They have it on the federal level. In parts, they have it also on the state level. Where they don't have this quota level is on the regional level, because there it's still this peer network. It's all about who is becoming a mayor or getting up for mayor, and there, women don't simply have the support, and they don't have quotas. The question then is, does it help a lot if you have a German chancellor, if you have, many German ministers, but if you do not have the broad basis, and we do not have it due to those problems on the regional level of women who stand up and fight for their rights. So quota systems, yes, they work. They don't only work in politics, they also work probably less so, but to a degree also in academia. That's the first point. The second point is, if you look at the, not at the public sector, but if you look at the huge global companies, what do they have to do? They have to come up with an estimate how many women they want to bring in leadership position within the next 2 years. And 50% of them say none, because there are none. There are no women, so we want to stay with the 0%. Others say, well, we want to get it 10%. Or 20% or 30%. But actually nothing happens if they don't reach the goal. Nothing happens. They just come up with those numbers. They're not getting a right face if they come up with those 0%, because they simply make the point there are no numbers, although we can show that there are a lot of numbers in all different disciplines around who would be qualified, or at least, which you could develop until they are qualified. But probably the most important thing is that nothing follows. I mean, if they do this, nothing follows. And probably even worse, if you look at the German ministries who come up with this law, they don't pertain to this law themselves, because German ministries are highly male. I mean, that all the top positions are filled with male people, with very, very few exceptions. So I think this should be changed as well. I mean, if you come up, and say, well, I try to reach this percentage. If you don't do this, then it should be enforced and not just go uncommented.
So it's enforcement.
Yeah, definitely.
There are so many studies now, and there's a famous one by McKinsey, but there's lots of others, to show that diverse teams way outperform, non-diverse teams. And so I do wonder if it shouldn't be more of a movement by the shareholders to push for diversity, right? Because then they're guaranteed almost, at least by statistics, to be able to get more in return. Similar to how in 2017, Vanguard and others got ExxonMobil to change its ways. But what were you going to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, sure, but shareholders in Germany, they don't do this. And then we have these Aufsichtsräte, and they really have to follow this 50-50, and I'm in two of them, but I'm powerless because all the decisions who they will get in as one of the principal CEOs is not discussed with me. So this doesn't make a change, and we see this empirically that although we have this 50-50, nothing changed. So we don't have enough power. So I'm not a shareholder, but at least I'm a member of the supervisory committee. So this one hope failed.
You've both touched on the different roles, or I would even say responsibilities, of either the private sector or of government. Or perhaps of civil society. What are there one or two things that would be on your top list of things that must be done in order to change those outcomes?
Me?
Yes,
of course. I have many things which need to be done and could be done. First of all, we could change the income system of typically female jobs compared to typically male jobs. And those differences are huge. If you look at medical doctors vis-a-vis nurses, things like, you have huge differences which do not correspond to the responsibility of them. If you look at the difference of a person who looks over a zoo, he earns so much more because he is supposed to have so much more responsibility compared to a person who looks for young children, is a school teacher. So there are fundamentally different rewarding systems according to occupations, and those occupations are gendered because they are a majority of men in one part of the occupations and a majority of women in the other part. Then we should have the right to know how much people earn. Because, I'm always blamed that I do not negotiate it well. And I don't know how I should negotiate, because I'm always a first woman in my job. And if I ask my predecessors, the men, what did you earn? They ask me, even you can tell me about my sex life, but not of what I earn. I mean, that's awful. So I do not have the transparency, and at the same time, I felt guilty, or I'm blamed even, that I do not negotiate right. So we need this, I don't have the English word for this, Entgelttransparenzgesetz urgently. Yeah, we always have German names like this, which cannot be translated for probably good or bad. Yeah, it's one word. So those are two things. The other things is that we have really to encourage women to take up higher positions and not discourage them. So we have to build up networks and coaching, and those coachings should not only be done by women but also by men. And we have seen a couple of very, very successful enterprises like this. I also think that internationalization would help, because women from other countries are much more self-certain that they can make it. So diversity, not just by gender, but by other attributes, helps the female case as well. So there is a huge plate of suggestions. There's also things that, if I now move to the academic sector, that we should not always only take people who already made it, like having thousands of citations and things like this, but to take into consideration that women lost, in a positive sense, 5 or 10 years because they were raising children or were caring for their parents. So if we recruit in terms of the potential of people, which you can quite well measure, then a lot would have been gained as well.
Kate Godall, what's at the top of your wish list? Transparency about salaries? Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I could reel off sort of, that list of business things. I mean, I mentioned maternity care, but you're quite right to point out that there's a bigger cultural problem
as long as maternity means mothers go out, it's a problem.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It was maternity plus paternity, right? Yeah. And it becomes equal, but it's, everything that you can suggest has something behind it that would then need to change in order for that to happen, right? Yeah. So, and I think what you're sort of touching on is this none of us are whole till all of us are whole paradigm, right? This whole choice of sort of binary choice is a false paradigm that we need to shift, and it affects any sort of oppressor group, right? And we're seeing this now with sort of the evolution of feminism to be intersectional. But I think the frustration there sometimes can be that really that means we should all be standing together so that, anything that isn't good for one section of the larger group, we all stand together to fight. But what it sometimes means is that we're all fighting internally about definitions and who goes first and all of that stuff. So I think, that in itself is something that we really need to start to kind of contend with. So there's big cultural issues that are just looming in so many ways when you start to think about the little things that we could be doing. I think it's the World Economic Forum that estimates we've got 100 years to gender parity, and that's
in
up.
Germany it's 120.
That's up from 83. It was 83 and now it's gone up.
Needle's gone the wrong direction.
And depending on the day, I feel more or less optimistic about whether that's accurate. There is just so much to be done.
Yeah.
May I add
please.
one other thing which I forgot, because when I talk about labor markets, then in Germany the assumption is that women should adapt to male career paths and male trajectories, though that they should become the better man, which is an approach which I cannot follow, in particular given that many things changed. We come back to digitalization, so on, and things like this. So we could really afford to come down to a 4-day working day per week with much more equality between men and women, and then, of course, decrease working hours or share leadership programs. But just to have, this male work trajectory is the only option of all options in how to get work and how to make a career is absolutely wrong. And it's unnecessary as well.
I want to pick up two threads. One, you mentioned the broader impact of digitization, what it makes possible in terms of the labor market and also the work week. But Kate, something you had also mentioned about networks and also mentoring, coaching. Since one of the themes for this event is related to digital technologies, what potential do digital technologies have to facilitate coaching, mentoring, and creation of communities of action? Kate, maybe turn to you first on that.
Oh, that's a tough one. I don't know if I agree with it so well in terms of... I'm still skeptical about sort of the realness of online communities, and particularly when you mention it in terms of a mentoring or coaching capacity. I want to point out that many of the mentors certainly at Halcyon, that have been mentors of our women entrepreneurs, some of the best ones have been men. Right, some of the best feminists are men, and I think that is something positive that we can sort of think about and talk about. Is that we have to all embrace these great allies, and it helps. I think people realize it's not a zero-sum game, right? We are all in it together, and anyway. But I do think about online and what it's done to create and sometimes hinder movements like Me Too. And certainly the Women's March would not have been possible without it. But it's very much, it's like the printing press, right? It is a tool to magnify everything. It doesn't select for quality, right? So everything goes out there more intensely. And we have to be mindful of what it is we say and how we behave, because it's just all more intense. And as we've seen the ability of women to organize, we've also seen greater organization among, incels and white supremacists. And so it's a double-edged sword for sure.
Jutta Allmendinger, thoughts for you?
Well, I'm entirely with her, actually. I want to add one single thing. It's... When I look at Germany, then, of course, I would also say that, as I said before, that male-female coaching systems work better, but the one which work best are with men who have daughters. I mean, those are the real revolutionaries in the moment in Germany who suddenly come up, you know, with quotas because they saw that they invested a lot of money in their daughters, and now they don't get to the position they thought they would get. So they immediately changed their mind. And I can't tell you how many really strange conversations I had with hardcore non-quota men who suddenly changed their mind. And I said, well, why did you change your mind? Oh, my daughter simply can't make it. This is
love
just
karma.
It's just, you know, I don't know what to do with this practically, whether, you know, we should now ask. But I just wanted to support this in terms of social media. Yesterday I was talking about 100 years of suffrage, and therefore in preparing for this talk, I studied a little bit young women who wanted to go in politics and did their first couple of steps. And then they were just terrified because, you know, all of this social media shit which they got, and, you know, those personal insults which they simply couldn't take. So they are very, very bad issues to the social media as well. And in Germany, for the women issue, I do not see broad social networks which have the power to get to a female movement. It was fine with this, against,
Very good. All right.
But then we also probably have to discuss it in a different way. How does it change our work, and does it give more possibilities for women to combine work and family? And then again, I would say it doesn't help as long as men do not use the same system as well, because otherwise women have just a double shift that they have to concentrate at home and to do the housework and to take care of children and to take care of their older parents. So we have more and more empirical data that it's getting worse and not better with this technology.
So a double-edged sword indeed. I think at this point we should open it up to your comments and questions. I want to ask you to please identify yourself and also wait for the microphone. So questions? Yes. Well, we're going to go here and then to Alexandra. Yes, sir.
My name is Andre Goodfriend. And on the discussion, well, first, am I right, and feel free to correct me, in thinking that the goal is to have a society where everybody's backgrounds, everybody's skills, what people bring to a diverse environment is valued for themselves, and that we are together in this regardless of what our gender, sexual orientation, etc. might be. So with regard to quotas, if the goal there is to create an environment where we feel like we are accustomed to engaging with each other with all members of society, all genders being represented, and we see the benefit of that. What are the measures? At what point do we think that we have achieved that goal, and should quotas be ended?
It takes 2 generations to cement cultural change, for the most part, right? And so I don't love quotas, and I don't want to see them be something we use forever. But I think that they are a very necessary tool to get us over the hump until people don't have to apply them. Would you say something similar?
Well, I always think about 3 different steps. The first is, and I studied, this is probably a strange example, but I see it all over. I studied symphony orchestras. I studied 100 symphony orchestras in 4 countries. So it was back in 1988, before reunification in Germany. It was East Germany, it was West Germany, it was Great Britain, and it was the US. And I looked how the way men and women were interacting, how they thought about themselves and the other sex, how much they like to work and things like this, depended on the gender ratio. So if we have all male orchestras, men loved it. They loved to go to work, they loved, everything about their job. wonderful, the best world. Then we saw women coming in particular in East Germany, because they were running out of men, because they wanted to have more orchestras in West Germany. So men were allowed to get in, and when 5% men came in, it was fine. They were women came in. It was the other way around. Women came in. They were not taken really seriously, and according to Rosa Beth Kanter and other women who theorized about this, those women just behaved like men. You know, if you are only one among of 10, or one among of or 10 or among 100, you sort of adapt. Those are token women to adapt. It's more or less the same the other way around. So after this adaptation process, we also found orchestras with 20-30%, and things really got worse. So women didn't want to go to work anymore. Men didn't want to go to work anymore. They thought that the music is getting worse. Everything was just frustrating. And then, and this makes your point, once they were up at 38-40%, everything was fine again, because they did not consider themselves as members of a team of women or a team of men, but they looked at the individual qualities of the musicians. And this is exactly what we find when we study teams of academics working on a project. This is exactly the same which I find in my institute, which has 400 people. And when I entered 10 years ago, there were no women in leadership positions. Then I hired the first one. She adapted perfectly. Then I hired the second one. And now, having men and women in leadership position became something normal and increases and really betters the overall output. So it's not a question having one, it's not a question having two women, it's really this proportional fit that should be in place.
Reach a critical mass. I think next, Alexandra? Yes.
Thank you. All right, hello, my name is Alexandra Hohenscheid, and this question is really open to anyone. And we've seen movements like Me Too, especially with social media, really echo across cultures. Yeah. And so my question is, really, to what extent do you think that the issues facing women are universal across cultures, and what potential is there for international cooperation in combating these issues?
I think you have far more experience on this in terms of seeing the differences between...
If you go to the arts, I would really say it's an international movement, this Me Too. People really, in terms of sexual harassment and things like this, it really is an extremely forceful and powerful movement. This is what I would say. The question then is whether this transfers to the labor market, whether it transfers to the academic system. In terms of sexual harassment, yes, it does. But then leaving this sexual harassment and going to the harassment in terms of income, which you could also call an harassment, or, equal chances in other things, or, your standings, the respect you get for work. So it's not very easy to translate. So I think we need to have a Me Too movement, an international one, and the Me Too was an international one for the other areas or domains in life as well. Urgently.
Other questions? Yes, back in the back we have. Yes.
Question is for Jutta. Having had a female chancellor in Germany since I think 2003 or 4, who was born and raised in East Germany, where there was equality of men and women, at least in the workplace, I cannot see that she has brought about any change with respect to, payment, equal pay for women. I cannot even say that I see her being perceived as a woman in any way, except for when she got that back rub by George Bush. And that, I think, is a sad thing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is a very problematic question for me because I don't have a control group in a way. I mean, it's always difficult to talk about one woman and what she did and what she didn't because we don't have the control of what would have happened without her. I think for many women, she made a difference, and I would count myself as well to a woman who says, well, I mean, in a German newspaper, there was this lead article saying, it's a maximum of power you can have as a woman that nobody talks about how you are dressed. And nobody talks about how she is dressed anymore, you know. But this is not really your question. I mean, your question, but this has something to do with, you know, changing the way women are perceived right. And what do they wear in a way. So it's a little bit. But she never considered herself as a feminist. I mean, she said this quite openly, and she never wanted to be at the forefront of a feminist movement. And I always ask myself, contrafactual, would she have been as successful as she most certainly has been for a certain period in time for the European movement and other things if she would have openly proclaimed that she is a feminist? But again, you know, this I can't answer. I'm also not sure whether it's true that the populist parties, the AfD, had this strong, increase in votes because they could blame a woman all the time, or whether it has been due to her 2015 statement, well, we'll manage it with all those refugees. So I'm an empiricist, and this question is always hard for me, in particular because I don't see many women in leadership position who really plays this female point. So it's hard. The only thing which I can take out of it, this is what I said before, that, and this also pertains to your questions about quota, if we only start with a quota system in leadership position, the question is whether this really helps, and whether it would be not much more helpful if we would start this quota system, with very, very young people, probably even in this, I don't even know whether I would defend my own point, but it's just to make my position clear. To say we want to have 40% of each school class of women, taking MINT subjects or something like this to change this one. Yeah, but whether it's just Merkel or whether those are the circumstances, I don't know. I mean, she did not vote for the right for marriage of all people, but she also, supported at least, some very, very important legislation like the return from part-time to full-time work and this. And yeah.
If I could actually follow up on that, because you said you're an empiricist, when we look at the data, and it strikes me, particularly in academia, there have been efforts over decades now to fill the pipeline, to not just start at the top, but to also make sure that there are women at all levels and that they could advance. What's your experience? What has worked and what has not worked if you look at Germany?
Yeah, what really worked beautifully is that we get those women into very, very excelling PhD students who outperform men. They are excellent. But then there comes this period of life where they have to make this decision whether they want to have a family or not. And I'm in my own institute now primarily work with men, saying, well, I mean, if you want to work here, then you have to take on leadership in the family as well, and not just at work. And if you have an organization of 400 or 500 people, this works very, very well. So we now have much more women becoming professors than men, and they acknowledge each other that women are better. So it can be changed, but it has not been changed on a broad level. But I'm very optimistic that if you implement organizational rules and standards and cultures, this can be overcome.
We have a question here.
Hello, my name is Cara Peng, and this question is, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but for Jutta Allmendinger. You had mentioned that you had done a study with the CVs of 2 men and 2 women with 2 months of maternity leave and 10 months, and you'd gone back to the hiring managers and asked why they didn't bring in the women either with 2 months or with 10 months for further interviews or whatever. And I assume that you also looked at the gender of the hiring managers as well, because in theory, women should be more understanding of the issues of the cultural biases and that. But a lot of studies tend to show that women are just as culturally biased as men, if not worse. And there are a lot of studies that say that women bosses are actually worse for women. And so I'm interested if you also looked at
I mean, that's a very interesting question. Thank you very much, because it also allows me to point out the distinction of having women as representatives and leaders in the political area, and whether or not they really do female politics. And this was a question about Angela Merkel, obviously, as well. And I would very much distinguish those 2 parts. One is about representative democracy. This means that you have to have as many women, or should have as many women as you have voters, also in the parliament, which means in Germany that you should go up from 30% to 50%. The same applies to the United States, but this by far would not mean that those 50% of women would go for female politics. And this you can see in many areas. You could also see it in France. And so leadership positions of women do not go along with necessarily female feminist politics. And now to the question which you started, yes, we looked at the gender, and it indeed didn't matter. So men and women as people who had to make the decision behaved the same.
Hi, my name is Taylor Nelson, and I had kind of a question for all 3 of you. I'd like to hear all your perspectives. One thing that I'd kind of like to hear your perspectives on is the issue of emotional labor that women are expected to carry. I've been reading a lot, especially in wake of like Me Too and the Kavanaugh hearing, where there's studies that show even though women are achieving more success than ever before, more women are graduating from college, more women are running for office and things like that, but they're still expected to carry the same amount of emotional labor, meaning they are expected to be aware of their partners, their friends, their family's feelings more than men are. How do we address that issue going forward? Because women can be as successful as they can be, but I think that if we're still expected to carry this burden of emotional labor on top of all the things that we'd like to achieve, where men aren't held to that standard, like how can we move past that hump?
It's pretty much why I got divorced.
Kate, you want to start?
No, I just mean, I'm working full time, pour my soul into that. I've got 2 children who I pour my soul into. I couldn't keep track of my husband's family's birthdays and all of that, the mental and emotional labor that went into also maintaining a marriage. And for me, honestly, it became a pretty horrible choice. So I think it's a very real issue, and I know there's been lots of studies on it, but that's my personal take on it. It's definitely, a thing. Have you done any studies on it, Jutta?
Well, what we saw that women before they enter a relationship are very clear about this division of labor. I'm not sure whether this emotional work is the right thing to say, but we have many couples in which both are now working in Germany, increasingly so. I mean, just 30 years before it was not the case. There was this man working, and the woman was working as well, but she was working in support, paying the bills, getting the shopping list ready, even if the man then was going shopping, but she had to write down what he was
sorting out school applications, doctor visits.
This is entire, writing birthday cards, cards saying thank you if one has been invited and things like this. And I myself, I experience this all the time, and I got pretty upset because I have to work, and at the same time, I have to do all this, probably you call it emotional work. I mean, caring for our friends, saying, yes, we can do it this evening, and, oh, thank you very much, it has been nice, food has been wonderful, then riding up. So it has been a hard time in my own marriage as well, but we overcame this now because, I mean, it's so clear that there needs to be a division, not just of labor market participation and not just of who cares for children, but also of those day-to-day things. And as I understand young women, they are much, much clearer on this. And we can also teach them that they should not only think about this very moment where they are so deeply in love, but also arrange their life such that they can look, how will this person probably develop in 5 years, and how much will he stick, to what they both promised themselves. And this, of course, is a huge problem also in giving birth, because most of the couples which we interview now, they say, before they have kids, of course, we share all work. Of course, we take, the husband takes out, or the partner takes out 6 months. And then in reality, it simply doesn't show, because this woman says, well, I mean, it's so nice to have time with children, which indeed is, and they should have, their 5 or 6 months. But then they also, should see what it means, 5 years from now. And this is hard, but I think this is something which we have to think for ourselves, but also which we have to teach our children.
I would just add, and I think it's building on the comments that have been made, it really does demonstrate that if we're talking about advancing the goals that women have, the needs and what they want to have for their lives, it's not just about women. It's the adaptation across the system and across the society. And I do think, particularly if I look at younger men and women, they have the aspiration to share that more equally, but they run into the reality of the structural impediments, the problems, the way the labor market works. So I do think it remains a challenge. I look at this among my friends. I think of it as the orchestration of the collective.
Yeah, but nothing happens. I mean, she was quoting this study which I just did. I mean, it was not that women have not been invited. It was that women who took 10 months out were more often invited than women who took only 2 months out. But men have been invited regardless of whether they took 2 months out or 10. So actually, the major conclusion of this study was, hey, men, why don't you take those months out? Nothing will happen to you. It's all fiction. Yeah. So it's not just, structural, it's the perceived, negative consequences of their careers.
I think it's
so they lack the courage to do this, because, the employers, they couldn't do anything. I mean, it's their right to do this.
Not all men, but it is structural in the United States, in that not all men have that option to take those 10.
Yeah, but in Germany they don't have the courage, period.
All right. Yes, let me come here, Banning, and then we have a question in the back.
Banning and Garrett, I'm going to go back to something Jutta said, and I'm interested in the sort of causality, because you pointed out the Greens had a quota system, 50%, and the AFD, no quota, and very few women. And I'm wondering about the causality. I would, not really knowing anything in detail, but it would seem to me the Greens have an ideology that women should be equal, and that coming up with a quota and agreeing on it would be probably, I would assume, much, much easier than AFD, which probably culturally is not feminist, to say the least. And so you have this problem of changing their whole perspective on women themselves. I think of the alt-right or the working class people that support Trump in this country. I don't think they have a very progressive attitude toward women, and therefore, how do you change that culture? Because the men are the problem, and I would think that that's reflected in what you are seeing? I don't know if that's a correct interpretation, but it's this causality question.
Well, it's not just causality. I mean, yeah, probably it's causality. I mean, the question which you're raising is, would the Green be so successful if they would introduce quota? I mean, yeah, would they get the same amount of votes if they would have quota? This is, in a way, what you are asking.
I mean, their ideology would say they should do this. And the people supporting them probably, in theory.
I mean, the
that,
AFD is really,
side.
I mean, we don't want to talk, yeah. I mean, you know that the AFD has very, very strong women in the leadership position. So they Alice Weidel or Petri, I mean, they are strong women. And still, the AFD is anti-woman and anti-gay or homosexual leader, although, she is open lesbian. I mean, this is sort of perverse. I mean, this entire party is... but then let us do it with the Free Democratic Party, who don't hate us. I mentioned this because we always wonder how can it be possible that we had this huge decline in female representation in this between 2013 and 2017. And this is all due to the CDU and the Social Democratic Party losing votes, and by this losing a lot of women in the parliament, and the other parties gaining votes. And well, one has to investigate. It's actually a highly interesting question whether the AFD gained votes because they don't have a quota system.
We had a question in the back.
In a way related to your question.
Actually, I'm going to pick up a couple questions here, the gentleman here, and then on the right.
Hi. I was born in India, but I've been an American citizen from 1972. I have a little question is, since voting for government formation started in the West, like in India, it came in 1947, where there was no question whether men or women should get the vote at the same time. There may have been a question whether poorer minorities should have the same vote than those who were middle class or the rich. But in the West, it seems, including the United States, the men had the vote first, and then it took a long struggle for women. Whereas for me, the perspective is if I can vote, and if that minority guy whom I dislike more than my wife or my daughter, if they can vote, these people are quite capable of. And there was a gentleman who said that the fathers are saying their daughters must have an opportunity, or the wives must have. And that was the attitude in India for us. So given that, is there a greater distrust between men and women in the West than in non-Western countries like India?
Let me give you a second to ponder that. I want to pick up, there's a question over here on the right, because was it you have? Yes, please. I'm also just mindful of the time. I want to get in as many questions as I have. Please.
Yeah, my name is Ada Pinkston. I'm a Halcyon Arts Fellow as well. And
I just want to give a shout out to the 3 Halcyons.
Yeah, we're all. Yeah, but my question is similar to your question. I'm actually interested in intersectionality, right? So, we were talking, or you guys were talking about how quota systems, like how that changes the system, right? Or excuse me, how do quota systems change the society, right? But usually, like in the context of the United States, right, the affirmative action quota system basically mostly benefits white women, right? So then it's like, okay, well, we have this, and I have a background in psychology as well. So we have this this quota system that mostly benefits white women. So how do we put within the structure of this search for equity, or this search for or desire for equity? How do we place within the movement more conscientious intersectionality? And I'm curious too, because it's like I'm thinking about right now, and 5 years ago there was research that was done that demonstrated that African American women are like really educated, right? But now within the context of the US, like most institutions college institutions aren't even hiring tenure track professors anymore, right? So it's like now that this profession isn't a white man's, or people that are prescribed to the illusion and imaginary of whiteness, being in academia isn't a white professor or white man professor anymore. Now it's like, well, you can't get tenure track positions. So I'm curious, again, so it's like, okay, so there's these structures that are there, and we put, or like a lot of lawmakers are putting things in place to make sure that there is equity, but then the structures change. So then, really, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. I know that was, but it's also related to what you were just saying.
Kate, do you want to take that?
Yeah, again, I'll defer to the academic in terms of the entire length of democracy and intersectionality of the feminist movement. I'll ping off you maybe, but it's more your...
Yeah, I mean, I see this very clearly, and this is why it's the very beginning of my short input. I said, well, we cannot talk when we say, well, men and women are equal. We simply cannot only talk about men and women. It's also about, race. It's also about ethnicity. It's also about age. It's also about refugees, migrant background, and things like this. So I would like to address all those things in terms of inequality, unequal access, unequal chances, and things like this. Now, this discussion has been about men and women, and I'm much more working on this intersectionality and what does it do in addition to it. And we ran a lot of different experiments on this as well, which absolutely supports your point. So if they vote, if organizations invite, first they invite men, then invite women, but then it's a third, fourth, fifth position. They invite black men and black women. And so there is a lot of things is to be done, to decrease these multiple impediments which we see. But I have been, yesterday I was at it's a German embassy, and there were a couple of Afro-American women who were so smart and so enthusiastic, and I thought they are really getting the next job as a president. Don't you agree? I mean, it probably was a huge selection bias. But I have never seen so many extremely smart, highly educated, and going for it black American woman, than yesterday. But I'm not so familiar with the United States as you are, but this gave me a lot of hope, actually. And I thought that we should do it with our Turkish women as well, because they are extremely discriminated in the moment, and other nationalities.
Any thoughts in response to the question about the role of cultural and historical?
It's not just that we don't like to have women in our parliament. We also don't like badly educated people in our parliament. So we primarily have public servants, male public servants in our parliament, and lawyers. So huge ranges of professions simply are missing. So this is my question of whether or not we really have something like a representative democracy in Germany. And I would say no. We do not, because the major parts of groups are excluded. And I'm also talking about immigrants, about refugees.
We have time for some final questions or comments.
Thank you so much for this talk. So my question, I think, goes very much in line with what you just discussed the last 5 minutes. It's about and I include myself, being a young woman, entering the labor market, having made first experience. So at university, I thought, oh, there's nothing like this gender gap. So everything is okay. So I have the same possibilities.
All my young women say this all the time.
Exactly, yeah. But then you enter the labor market and you see that it's not like that. And then you get married and you have a child, and then you see it's even worse. So what would you say? What would you suggest young women, as the young women who are sitting here, to do against it on a personal level? So what would you say from your experience?
I think it's a great question, and I would ask you to, Jutta and Kate, to respond to that, and also then to any final comments that you might want to make. So,
I think as much as you can, really make sure that you know yourself before you commit to any other extended relationships. So know yourself and know what you want and know what you're getting into. I would say in terms of then going into the labour market, a few things to be aware of. Negotiate when it comes to pay. I can guarantee you, as somebody who supervises women and men, I see firsthand how much the men will push for raises and all kinds of other perks. And all I have to say to the women is, yeah, no, we're not going to do that right now, and they back down. I mean, just every time. And you know, it becomes a dilemma for me, like, should I just pay them more anyway, right? As somebody who considers herself a feminist. So I'm just telling you, every woman out there, you fight less hard than the men do when it comes to that, still to this day. And just find out how to do it effectively, because it can be done very politely and very effectively, but you should be fighting for way more money. Similarly, just in terms of then when you plan a family, there are some stats that we didn't go over that are pretty significant in terms of, you know, the length of time that you take yourself out of the labour market, and then, you know, how much you don't do at work as a result of raising families, and the extensive wealth gap that leaves you with at the end of your life versus a more sort of concentratedly working spouse. So in terms of family planning and if you have the luxury, you know, really be thinking about how you're going to manage for that.
I mean, I continue. If you have the luxury and there are two people raising children, it is really worthwhile to stick with what you usually say before you have children, that you do this division of labor with raising children as well as caring for the elderly. And this helps. So if you have to distribute it among two shoulders, it's much, much easier than on one shoulder only. So I always have prime problems with mothers who don't have a support network. And mothers who have a support network, be it partners or be it mothers or fathers, don't be shy and ask them for help, because one needs to have help, and the public system is not. I mean, you have evening discussions where the public childcare system won't step in Germany at all. So stay with your plans and you know, don't be too shy to ask other people who made it. Get yourself acquainted with networks, and this helps people a lot. I also think it's one of the things which we have to tell in the academic system, because if we're asking about the academic system, all professors, be they female or male, you know, that this is an integral part of the yearly conversations which they have to do in terms of supervising and things like this. So if you mention it, then it helps. I'm not supposed to go into family things, but if you ask me, you know, I can give you my personal advice how it would be possible. And I would say, well, don't stay out for more than 6 months. Don't decrease your work time more than to 30 hours a week or something like this. Stay in touch with the working force and be a part of projects which were running before, although you do not invest full time. Go to conferences, claim if you can't take your kids that they should have, you know, a child care system at huge conferences and things like this. Try to get in touch with other women in an organization. So all those things can be changed. It's not you, and you have to tell you all the time, it's not your personal problem. It's a problem of an organization, and this organization needs you. they really need you because you're usually smarter than men are. And, to place it's not easy, but to find supporters, to find probably also unions, which are not very strong in this business, it helps. It really does help. And then you have to be very disciplined with yourself as well. I mean, it's hard to say, well, I'm now playing for 2 hours with the kid, but then I would also go to work. And this is hard. But it's hard for a given period of time, and later you will be rewarded because children usually live like mothers who are happy with their life and self-confident and think that they achieved something. It does not disrupt your relations with your kids at all. I mean, this is what...
Working mothers achieve a lot because they know they've got this much time to do
children love working mothers. All our studies show that children love working mothers. They adore them, so it's not that they suffer and that you destroy your children and their life. This is awful German parlance.
I think that is a wonderful note to end on, and also I appreciate the very practical advice, because I think we do have a lot of, actually for all generations, that was
well,
good.
I mean, on a personal note, the only reason why I have a child is because I studied in the United States. So you might find this sort of strange coming from Germany where I have all this child allowance. But in the United States, and I got my PhD at Harvard, I suddenly saw all those women who brought their babies in the lecture room. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. I mean, so... And then, going back to Germany, Munich, it was in 1993 when I had my first job, and I brought in my little boy, who was really nice. I mean, he was not crying all the time. But who didn't like this? It was primarily the young women. They hated it. They told me that I'm a Reverend mother, and oh my God, this guy, he will be, he will fail in his life. And now I recently visited Munich again with this now 24-year-old, more or less doctor of medicine, and they said, well, what? I mean, this is Germany. Don't take this.
Good. I want to thank Jutta Allmendinger. Kate Godall, thank you for a very rich discussion. I would invite you to continue the conversation with our two panelists and also with one another at the reception afterwards. So please join me in thanking our panelists for